Mom's good at waiting. We can stand for hours, but she won't tie and untie shoelaces like my brother, who yanks pigtails and pinches with monkey hands that smell of sweaty nickels. I practice her signature in the air, a clump of curlicues, all the round letters of the alphabet. My brother tugs my arm, points to the end of the line. Patty Garcia's there with teeth like the keys on Mr. Sergio's piano, eyes so big she blinks a lot to keep them in. At school, she's who we chase.
I think it's really interesting the way this poem explores how power dynamics develop between people who find themselves in more or less similar positions, between the siblings and then between Patty Garcia and the siblings. And I'm wondering, do you think that being the author of the poem gives the speaker of the poem any kind of special power in the dynamics?
I think for this poem, it was something that I had thought a lot about hierarchy and about tension even within under-resourced communities. And it was something that I knew that I wanted to talk about. I didn't know how I would do it, but it came up with this idea of, that even in school, there were people who were even more under-resourced than we were, or who in, some communities, it's like whoever's darker or whoever, there's also, colorism that happens within communities. At least it happened in my Mexican American community. So I think it was something that I thought a lot about as I wrote the poem. And I'm glad that, it's evident in sort of like the telling of the poem.
How much of the poem is autobiographical for you, and how much are you constructing from imagination?
And with this particular book and the themes that I found myself sort of drawn to, they were definitely pulled from my life. And I think at some point I described the book as I was trying to write this sort of warped autobiography, which is a little tricky to explain in poetry, right? Because it's like a different, but there's definitely a lot of overlap. And I think that for me, it was important for me to talk about the things that I was haunted by, pestered by, populated by.
One of the great things about this poem is the way you ground your imagery in the senses. Like I can feel the tugging of the pigtails, and you write the smell of sweaty nickels, and I can smell that. Smell in particular can be such a difficult sense to evoke in writing.
For sure, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Is that something for you that you've really actively worked hard at cultivating, or do you feel like that's been a more natural, spontaneous ability for you to describe the senses?
I think it was something that just happened naturally, so I can't take too much credit for it. It was just something that kind of evolved in my practice as a poet. But I do think that one of the reasons why this poem is so tactile is because it attempts to sort of draw you in through the lens of a child. And I think as a child, it's all about sort of the parent, what's immediately around them. And it's just very sensory, like what the child is paying attention to, like the smells and who is next to them. So there's less sort of intellectualizing the situation. It's just sort of a presentation through the world of a child. We sit at the edge of my bed and pull off my clothes. The dollar is strong and scientists create an igloo for a man who's been dead over 10,000 years. His last meal, acorns and venison. Summer was sweet, you had gone. I practiced sleeping, first watch Rodney King's beating on videotape, then the fossil of a Mesozoic bird curled inside its egg like an eyelash, declared the most ancient unborn.
I really love how this poem connects personal moments in life to public moments. And also to history.
Sure.
The connection is a way of remembering personal moments, but it also rightly elevates those moments in terms of their importance in the development of a life. How did you bring all these images together? Was this all actually happening at that time in your life, or were you inspired by other scientific moments or discoveries?
The poem is sort of it is a broken sonnet. It initially began out trying to write a very traditional sonnet, and there's a turn at the end of a sonnet traditionally. And the more I worked with the poem began as sort of this poem about the other, or the lover, or the romantic you. And then what tends to happen, I think, throughout the entire book is there's this sense of dread. There's this sense of harm that is part of the subtext, the surrounding, the environment. All of it is sort of imbued with this sort of dread. And I think it just so happened that I had some threads of this article that I had read in a science magazine or a newspaper about the care that had been given of the uncovering of this man that had been dead so long ago. And then I was also fascinated with this idea that there was this fossil of something unborn. And I think in the book, there's a lot of talk about what is able to transform and what is not allowed to transform.
Yes.
What is able to live and what is not allowed to live.
Yeah. Another thing that you mentioned, this being a sonnet, how did you start, with 14 lines and you just cut it down and pared it away? How long did it take you till you got till the final version of it?
Oh, it takes me a very long time. I'm ashamed at how long it takes me to kind of release a poem from my hands. And I think this poem began probably in maybe, it probably took me about 9 years from the time that I sort of initially began the poem. I wrote this poem in the Columbia MFA program.
Oh, nice.
I remember,
Okay.
So I remember writing this poem and it being pretty finished. And then just along the way, as I continued to work on the book, I started to then kind of just crystallize it almost, the way that the fossils are sort of crystallized in this amber is just to make it even more hyper focused and just tearing away at little pieces to make it more clear. So I think I would say this poem probably took it's so disturbing to think about it, but maybe about 7 years where I felt, obviously I was working on other material, but it was something that I began thinking about. I execute things. I try on all these different hats and then at some point I just let it go. And I think it's pretty done.
There's some poets, like famously Walt Whitman, right? And he was revising until he died, essentially. But you feel like you come to a point where you can say.
But when I say that, it means, what does that mean? It means that I'll still read a poem that is in the book, and as I'm reading it, I may make some changes. I'm one of those poets, I'm constantly reimagining and thinking, well, what is possible, and trying to flex the language in a way that I want to continue to kind of just make it as energetic, language as energetic as the moment was. Come back with me to the ruins. We will look through family photographs. I can show you what the wind and I did. Who keeps the stars from falling out of the sky? Macho, our dog, used to curl up on the patio and yawn. I remember playing on the grass when Mom came to spank me, and he jumped up, bit her hand.
I particularly love the opening of the poem. Come back with me to the ruins. We will look through family photographs.
Mm.
And I love this connection between the words ruins and family, because it's, to me, very meaningful. I initially think of ruins as a place that was abandoned long ago, an ancestral place, maybe forgotten, that a family came from or their ancestors came from. And then looking through ruins or an archaeological site is like looking through photographs and remembering the people who lived there.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, I think of a modern family in more metaphorical ruins, and the harm and the pain and the destruction family members can cause each other. And what seems to be a memory from childhood becomes something of a parable for divine justice almost, with the mother being bit by the dog. And it got me to thinking, for you, is writing a poem a place to correct wrongs or reimagine history or justice? And I'm wondering, in addition to that, what parables or koan have inspired you as a writer, or are there certain writers that you turn to for that kind of inspiration?
I don't think that I'm the kind of writer that's something that's on my mind, but I'm the kind of writer that is looking to show the truth of something. And I think that when you decide that that's what you will do, no matter how painful, how shameful, how embarrassed you are, many things are revealed, and one of them is justice, and sometimes healing. So I think I'm more I'm more interested in following the truth of something, digging for that, than maybe for the sake of justice.
Yeah.
So I think that that's the first thing. I have been the other thing about the writers, like I read so much that I often, it's like a tributary of things, that I pull from and think about. So
Totally.
oftentimes it's difficult for me to sort of talk about that, but I do think that I have been influenced a lot by plays. I'm also a playwright, and I've done a lot of work with that. That has been very influential in sort of the crafting of this book. In addition to, I think the first things that I ever read as a kid were fairy tales.
Yeah.
And I think that there is this mythological texture to the book that is relying on being able to talk about the terror, which I think fairy tales do magnificently. Like they're so depressing, they're just filled with these crazy things that are happening to children, and this danger, and if they're not supposed to eat the grape, but then they eat the grape and then they're turned into stones, or there's just so much. It's also very fantastical, and I think I can't really think of a particular parable, but I can think of fairy tales.
What are some of your fairy tales that come to mind?
There's the one of the swans, of the girl that's knitting these sweaters for her brothers who were turned into swans, the wild swans.
I don't know that one.
Yeah, that one's, I think, by Hans Christian Andersen. And that one's really interesting because she's able to save all of the brothers except for one. So he's able to turn into a boy, a man again, but then one of his arms is always a wing. Just one.
Wow.
So I know a lot of them. I think Italo Calvino talks a lot too about fairy tales. There's a lot of work that he's done around that that I read and was really interested in later on. But I think the effect of that is sort of understanding that you can move through a great deal of time in a matter of a paragraph. And that's what fairy tales do. There's always these very punitive measures for children who were really
Yes.
unable to make the right decision, who are penalized, who somehow or
Mhm.
another don't have parents around, and are subject to these very punitive measures because they decide to be kids. And I think
Mhm.
that's something that as a kid, I think that I wasn't reading them in that way. I was reading them just to be sort of taken away.
Sure.
And I think that there is a layer of that to my work. There's a layer of sort of presenting the present, but also creating some space for a little bit of imagination or fantasy um, from the reader.
There's a lot of tension and a lot of threat looming, and it you thread the needle very well, so thank you.
Oh, thank you for saying that. One thing that I've been very fascinated by is this idea of the uncanny and the dread, and how, oftentimes you can watch a movie and be like, I need the light on, or
Yeah.
you're just kind of scared. And I've never really had a book of poems per
Mhm.
se that has done that.
Yeah.
And I wondered a little bit about how to do that throughout the book. And I realized that a lot of that comes in subtext, in
Mhm.
perception, in sort of size. Like there are many things that happen in the world of the speaker that present the speaker as being very small and looking up at
Yeah.
the stars and sort of like using the moon as reference, the sea, things that are much bigger than them.
Yeah.
In the romantic longhand of the night, let's kneel on gravel, tear apart the lace of fruit, blade the wool from lambs who kiss hard, eat the meadow's changing face. Late the lark's a con of hands that frown aloud and spin tales free of green. Let's break into picnics over the phone, befriending men who crack safes and win ribbons for pigs that curry in the grain. Let's soap each face locked in a bathroom, slip them a letter written in the night's romantic longhand. Let's fake it the right way, draped in the right light for the wrong person. Although we say we aren't, we're seeking the tricky algorithm of travel. Boys who wager swans first and survive on cobwebs and capture.
That sense of fairy tale comes through beautifully, particularly in that final couplet, boys who wager swans first and survive on cobwebs and capture. Love that. And then also eat the meadow's changing face and blade the wool from lambs. I really love blade the wool from lambs because it's not an expression that I've heard before. It's not a use of blade that I've heard before. And you think of something like wool that is more benign and a thing of comfort maybe. And then you think, in putting that with blade, something that's much more menacing
Yeah.
and dangerous is
Mhm.
very fresh to me, and I love that.
Thank you for noticing so much. I think it's almost like an urban pastoral type poem. I think now that that lot of the language and the environment is very different than the rest of the book, but I think the feeling behind it is definitely similar to the rest of the poems.
Well, I want to thank you again for reading these poems for me and for the people who will be watching our interview, and I look forward to seeing more from you.
Lisa, thank you so much for interviewing me and for just coming with a lot of really great questions. It was beautiful to read the poems again and just to kind of talk with you and be in conversation. So I'm appreciative. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you. Love it.
Awesome.